Good morning. Would you state your full name for us for the record?
Richard Abrams, A-B-R-A-M-S.
And I understand it's Dr. Abrams, correct?
Yes, M.D.
When did you graduate med school?
62 perhaps? Now you're going back. I'm 81 years old.
All right. And what was the next evolution in your career?
And then I entered the residency program of New York Medical College, Flower and Fifth Avenue hospitals.
And approximately what year was that?
Approximately 1964.
And for how long did you maintain that capacity?
I was drafted out of my residency at the end of the first year and was sent to the Air Force for 2 years, 1965 through 1967, where I was in charge of a psychiatric ward and in charge of administering ECT for that hospital.
Was that the first approximate time frame of exposure to ECT?
No, not at all.
So you'd been exposed in school prior?
Yes.
All right. Had you participated at the New York Medical Hospital?
New York Medical College.
Sorry, college. Had you participated at the New York Medical College with ECT in that era?
Yes, in my first year, let's say 1964 to 1965, that's when I was first introduced to ECT by the man who brought ECT to the United States in 1939, Lothar Kalinowski. And he was one of my teachers and was a primary influence on me to go into the field of ECT.
Up to this point in time, had you reached any conclusions as to how ECT was working in terms of its effectiveness?
No.
Okay. And to the present, do you have any understanding as to the mechanics of how ECT works?
I do not.
All right. Would you agree that that's the general state of the industry still today, that the practitioners of ECT don't have an understanding of how it works?
That's correct.
Is it fair to say that you would attribute the amount of electricity as the most variable cause of significance in potential risks and side effects associated with ECT?
Well, it is the amount and type of the electrical stimulus, because, as you will recall, the sine wave stimulus, which produced much more memory disturbance than the brief pulse stimulus, which replaced it. But the amount and type of stimulation, and then a third factor is the laterality or bilaterality of the placement of the stimulus. That is, either bilateral ECT on both sides of the head or unilateral ECT administered to one side of the head. So, if I may just summarize, the first thing was sine wave versus brief pulse. Brief pulse caused less memory loss. Then the next thing was unilateral versus bilateral. Unilateral caused less memory loss. And then finally, ultra brief pulse versus standard brief pulse, in which the ultra brief caused less memory loss. And I'd have to say those differences were equally important.
In terms of this evolution in time, I believe you identified the ultra brief pulse became available in the 80s to 90s. Did I get that right?
Correct.
Approximately when did you first recognize a difference in the potential side effects and risks associated with ECT with regard to the positioning of the electrodes?
That was when the same year that I returned to New York Medical College residency after leaving the Air Force. And at that time, I came back especially to work with the other leading expert in ECT, who was also at New York Medical College, and that was Dr. Max Fink.
Okay.
And
I'm sorry to interrupt. Approximately what year was your first involvement with Dr. Fink?
that would have been, let me think.
Was that also the,
It
sorry.
was 68, when I returned to New York Medical College after the Air Force, immediately afterwards. And I became aware of Dr. Fink's work while I was in the Air Force, in as much as I subscribed to a number of journals. And I read his research, and I came back especially to do research with him, which I did for many years. And the first study we did together had to do with unilateral versus bilateral ECT. Primarily the effects, the clinical effects, that is, improvement in, let's say, depression, and then also the side effects, the memory and other cognitive functions.
Had you reached any understanding of the reason why there was a difference in those side effects between the electrode placement of bilateral versus unilateral at that point in time?
That was a question that we never resolved in a definitive research fashion. We looked at various aspects, but could not reach a definitive conclusion as to the differential effects of unilateral versus bilateral ECT, the differential clinical effects.
And how about to the present? Had you ever reached any conclusion as to why unilateral caused less potential side effects following ECT than bilateral?
Other than the fact that the two hemispheres have different functions, and when you apply the electrical stimulus only to one hemisphere, you are avoiding, let's say, impairing functions of the other hemisphere. However, in any case, a convulsion is produced, a brain seizure, and that also by itself has generalized effects, and we were never able to separate out in our minds. I was never able to separate out in my mind, why there ended up being a difference. In other words, why stimulating one side of the head, even though a convulsion was produced, had less memory loss than stimulating both sides of the head with presumably the same convulsion. We never resolved that in a research setting.
And does that stand true in terms of your perspective of the industry today?
Correct.
In terms of your perspective of the effectiveness of the seizure induced by ECT when comparing a unilateral placement versus a bilateral placement, have you formed a conclusion that there's a difference?
That is something that I have studied with several different individuals from several different perspectives, including electroencephalographic and other aspects, but we never reached a definitive conclusion, and I do not even today have a definitive understanding of that.
How would you describe the difference, if at all, between the seizure that's induced unilaterally by electrode placement versus the seizure that's induced bilaterally?
That was one of the items that we studied but could not come to a definitive conclusion. There seemed to be something different about them. There might have been different electroencephalographic features as shown on computer analysis, which we did, but we could not come up with a final definitive statement as to exactly what was the difference. Oh, tape.
In terms of any understanding that you've reached over time as to the potential side effects associated with ECT in comparing seizure efficacy, have you reached any conclusions?
Well, the main conclusion is that you really must have a seizure in order to have efficacy.
All right. So how about the duration of seizure? Was there ever a period of time over your exposure to ECT that the duration of the seizure measurement became a factor to control as to potential side effects or risks associated with ECT?
We could never link seizure duration to any specific side effect of ECT. However, if the question about controlling the duration, if the seizure is very short, you do not get a therapeutic effect, and you do not get also any memory disturbance or confusion.
In terms of your first exposure to ECT, was there a measurement of time associated with inducing seizure that you had adopted as necessary to promote the therapeutic effects you were seeking with ECT?
It was a rule of thumb that was not based on any specific evidence in the literature, and that was it should last at least 30 seconds.
All right, why don't we...
But that we never published or anything like that. It was just a clinical rule of thumb.
And do you know where that rule of thumb came from?
Plucked it out of the air, as far as I know. There is no research data that I was aware of at that time.
Thank you. Inducing seizure from ECT. Other than the rule of thumb of at least 30 seconds, when did you first form an opinion, if you ever did, that there might be a seizure that could last too long as a risk associated with potentially causing more side effects from ECT?
Very early in my exposure to ECT, I became aware that a prolonged seizure, which had really not been specifically defined yet, could be associated with significantly more memory loss. And over time, a seizure duration of 2 minutes was deemed the maximum that would be useful, and it had become the practice of many ECT doctors in the, let us say, the 70s, late 60s, 70s, to terminate a seizure artificially if it went more than 2 or 3 minutes.
And generally, how would you describe your ECT practice in that window of time, 1976 to 1996? Had it stayed relatively the same in terms of the variables that we've already discussed, or had there been any evolution in your mind in how ECT was practiced in that window?
Well, I'll tell you what the most significant thing that happened in my mind during that period was. You'll have to decide how it refers to your question. Soon after I got to Chicago Medical School in 1976, it entered my mind that it would be possible to construct a more efficient or more advantaged or more advantageous ECT device than the Mecta, which is what we were using when I first got to the hospital. And that was, at that time, we were recruiting physicians, psychiatrists for the department, and at the professorial level. I was in charge of recruitment at that time. And the chairman of the department at the University of Iowa Medical School recommended Dr. Conrad Swartz as somebody to join our department, which he did as a professor. And shortly after he got there, it became obvious that he had an extensive knowledge of electricity and electronics because of his PhD in engineering that he had, in addition to his MD. And so we decided to collaborate on the development of what became the thymotron, which we actually introduced into commercial production in 1984, as I recall.
And when did Dr. Swartz join you in Chicago?
But I would say 81, 82.
Fair to say that other than yourself and Dr. Swartz, there were no other principal contributors to the creation of the thymotron?
There were none, other than the individual that we chose to manufacture, or first of all, to help in the design and the construction and the production of the thymotron. That was somebody I had known from New York Medical College, John Pavel, P-A-V-E-L. He worked for Dr. Max Fink as an electronics expert. And I knew him well. He had actually made some equipment for me for one of my ECT studies at Metropolitan Hospital. And so the three of us, Dr. Swartz, myself, and John Pavel, collaborated in the design and plan of the very first thymotron.
All right. As I understand it, the thymotron was first produced by the company Somatics LLC, is that correct?
Correct. Dr. Swartz and I formed that company in 1983, I think, was the year we formed it.
And was the purpose of forming Somatics expressly to market the thymotron?
Correct.
As opposed to any other purpose?
That is correct.
And that remains its purpose today?
That is correct.
Any other business other than ECT devices of Somatics today?
There are not.
When did you first form an opinion that was something that some patients complained of from ECT?
There were some studies done by Dr. Richard Weiner, W-E-I-N-E-R, of Duke University, which he presented at an American Academy of Sciences meeting, in which he reported that some patients had very long-term memory effects.
Approximately when was that you first became aware of Dr. Weiner's perspective of a long-term memory effect from ECT?
Well, I'm not sure that accurately states his statement. I don't know what Dr. Weiner
He
said.
published it
Okay,
in a
let
book.
me finish my statement. I don't know whether he said, these are what the patients reported, or I have determined that, but...
He studied that and said he determined that.
Okay.
He did a study. And the
Approximately when
year
was that?
of that study, let me say, late 80s. Very rough.
My question was the point in time where you first became aware that Dr. Weiner determined that patients had complained of long-term memory effects associated as a side effect of ECT. Late 80s after Somatics was formed?
But that's not an exact representation of what happened with Dr. Weiner. Dr. Weiner did a study that showed that some patients had long-term difficulty with personal memory, what he called autobiographical memory, and that there was a long-term effect that he actually found and reported at this meeting, which I attended, and I believe that would have been late 80s. I just don't know.
Let me see if I can phrase it a little differently. Other than how you've defined Dr. Weiner's determination that he made in that time frame of the late 80s as to the long-term memory effects associated with ECT, had you heard of that perspective before that point in time?
No.
By this point in time, Somatics had already begun marketing its thymotron devices. Device, thank you. Are you aware of any changes that Somatics undertook with regard to its marketing or disclosures associated with the purchases of its device that addressed Dr. Weiner's perspective that you had learned in the late 80s?
No.
Any reason why not?
I didn't agree with his study. And it was one of the reasons was that it was only published in the Proceedings of the American Academy of Science, and the Proceedings, which is a little book form, and it was never published in a peer-reviewed journal. And even years afterwards, it never appeared in a peer-reviewed journal, which led me to believe that the results could not be confirmed.
At any time to the present, has Somatics initiated any studies or tests with regard to this issue of long-term side effects associated with ECT?
No.
Any reason why not?
That's not our business.
Whose business do you believe it is?
Can you rephrase that? Can you repeat that question to me?
I'll
Okay.
rephrase. I believe I asked whether or not Somatics initiated any studies or tests to the present to assess the long-term side effects associated with ECT. I believe your answer was Somatics has not, correct?
Correct.
And my follow-up question was, why not? And I believe you said because it's not your business.
Correct.
And then my question is, who do you believe that business responsibility falls upon?
Academic psychiatrists.
Is there any reason that you're aware of that Somatics has not enlisted the academic psychiatrists to perform such studies?
Somatics doesn't enlist anyone to do studies.
Any reason?
That's not our business.
So other than, let me rephrase. Was there a period of time between Dr. Weiner's findings or conclusions about long-term effects associated with ECT and the present where your perspective has ever changed, that
Yeah.
long-term side effects are associated with ECT?
No, that has not. My perspective on that has never changed.
Are you aware of any others in the field of ECT besides Dr. Weiner that have ever reached a conclusion that long-term side effects are associated with ECT?
Yes, Dr. Harold Sackheim, S-A-C-K-E-I-M, when he was at Columbia University, published one or two articles or studies. I'm not sure if they were formal research studies or if they were opinion pieces. I don't recall, but he did reach the conclusion that long-term or permanent memory loss could occur in some rare patients who received ECT.
And do you recall approximately when that was?
That could well have been in the early 90s.
And what, if anything, do you recall as to the variables, if any, that were identified by Dr. Sackheim as attributing the long-term or permanent side effects associated with ECT in the early 90s?
As I said, I'm unclear as to whether he reached his conclusion because of a formal study of patients assessed before and years after ECT, or if he just based it on discussions that he had with patients who had ECT. I'm not sure. But I did object in writing to his conclusions, and my objection was published in the Journal of ECT. And I cannot give you the year. It would have been in the 90s.
And your objection was because you disagreed with his conclusions?
Correct.
Right. Fair to say that after Dr. Sackheim's publications in the approximate early 90s, Somatics did not change its marketings or disclosures in any way with regard to identifying any potential long-term or permanent side effects with ECT?
That's correct.
Was there ever a time that Somatics initiated any inquiry or effort anywhere to further any investigation as to whether long-term side effects were caused by ECT?
No, Somatics did not do so.
Shifting gears a little bit, over the course of the years that Somatics has sold its thymotron ECT devices, do you have an understanding as to how many different owner's manual editions have been generated?
From the very beginning, let me see if I can come up with.
I don't want you to guess, but if you have some awareness.
No, I'm going to give you my best estimate. I never guess. At least 12 to 15.
And what, if anything, is the triggering event that would cause a new edition of the owner's manual to be generated?
Almost always the introduction of some new special feature.
Is any aspect, as far as you're aware, of the updating of an owner's manual intended to address any new or different awareness of risks or long-term side effects associated with ECT?
No.
Are you aware of any practice within somatics that anyone at somatics affirmatively accomplishes to advise past purchasers of any new awareness of any permanent or long-term risks associated with ECT?
No, I am not.
At some point in time, I think on the webpage of somatics, a disclosure was, or a disclaimer, I think, was adopted by somatics. Are you familiar with what I'm referring to?
Not yet.
This was on your webpage as of, July of this year. Disclaimer, please note that nothing in this website constitutes or should be construed as a claim by Somatics LLC that confusion, cognitive impairment, or memory loss, short-term, long-term, recent, remote, transient, or persistent, cannot occur as the result of ECT. Are you familiar with that disclaimer?
I wrote it.
Right. When did you first write that disclaimer?
I do not recall. Within the last decade, certainly.
And what, in your mind, was the purpose of you including this disclaimer on your webpage?
My recollection is that it was at the suggestion of Dr. Swartz, who, at some time, decided that that would be an appropriate statement to include in the manual. We had never discussed it before. He suggested it. I agreed and wrote it, and then thereafter appeared in the manual.
Do you have any reason to believe that this disclaimer would have been retroactively distributed to prior purchasers of somatics ECT devices?
I do not believe it was.
No reason to believe it would have been?
No.
No efforts that you're aware of that were undertaken by anyone at somatics to share this new disclaimer with old purchasers of somatics devices?
I'm not aware of any such effort.
The way this disclaimer was drafted is in the negative, in that it says nothing in this website constitutes or should be construed that these listed long-term effects cannot occur as a result of ECT. That's drafted in the negative. Okay. You agree?
I agree it is.
Would you agree that that's a different statement than one that would have said, more or less, please be advised that long-term permanent memory losses can result as a side effect of ECT?
Are you asking me if that's a different statement?
Correct.
It is a different statement.
Right. Was there any conversations that you had with Dr. Swartz about drafting this disclaimer in the negative versus drafting a disclaimer more in the affirmative that, hey, world, these are long-term side effects?
We had no such discussion. Dr. Swartz has his own way of writing.
As you sit here today, do you have any reason to believe that anyone at Somatics has ever affirmatively generated anything to its purchasers at any time that permanent long-term memory loss is a risk associated with ECT?
I do not recall any such statement.
Had you ever heard, other than what you've already testified to this morning, which I think were two published perspectives from Drs. Weiner and Sackheim?
Correct.
Separating from published writings now to any shared perspective that you had ever been privy to, that long-term or permanent memory loss is a risk associated with ECT. Had you ever heard that before?
We're not talking about scientific publications, correct?
Correct.
Well, yes, of course. I read all the comments from the public in response to the 1995 and later 2011 requests for commentary on their down classification from class 3 to class 2. And I read many dozens of ECT recipients' claims of their experiences with ECT.
So would those be the original sources of information where you first learned that others were claiming that permanent long-term memory loss was a risk associated with ECT?
Oh, no. Probably at the very first American Psychiatric meeting, American Psychiatric Association meeting I attended back in 1967. There were groups picketing against ECT, and they were allowed to present some of their opinions at some aspect of the meeting, as I recall. I don't remember the details, but I certainly remember the fact that there were a number of people complaining about ECT, lay people.
And my question's a little more focused, I appreciate that, but it's the approximate first point in time, and maybe that's still it, where you first heard of a perspective of anybody complaining that long-term or permanent memory loss was a risk associated with ECT. Would that have been the 67 first meeting?
That would have been.
All right, so fair to say from that point in time to the present, there has always been, that you're aware of, complaints that permanent long-term memory loss is a risk associated with ECT.
Correct.
And fair to say that you just disagree with it.
I do.
I had a question about seizure activity. One of the notes in the owner's manual says, it is possible for seizure activity to continue in the brain after any or all the computer reports indicate seizure termination. Did you write that?
I did.
How is that possible?
It's in the nature of the brain.
Meaning?
Meaning that there can be localized seizure activity in the brain that is not detectable from surface electrodes.
If it's not detectable on surface electrodes, how do you conclude whether the seizure has concluded?
You're only left with visible muscle activity. Or you could, I should add, or with an accelerated heart rate if it did occur.
Compared to baseline?
Correct.
Do you have an opinion as to whether or not seizure activity can continue that is not visible to the naked eye regarding muscle activity?
Seizure activity in the brain?
Correct.
Yes, I'm certain it can.
Have you ever formed a conclusion as to what the possible causes for memory loss associated with ECT are?
I have never actually studied that point, but I have formed the opinion that the memory losses that can be observed in some patients who receive ECT are the result of hippocampal malfunction or dysfunction, temporary. the hippocampus essentially being the primary site of memory storage.
And what is it that has led you to reach that conclusion?
All of the many, many studies of hippocampal function in many different patients by many different authors, including, let's say, Brenda Milner was one of the famous authors. Many people, either way too many to cite, have determined to their satisfaction and to the journal's satisfaction that memory dysfunction is very often related to hippocampal dysfunction or damage.
And are you aware or have you reached an understanding as to how that hippocampal malfunction or dysfunction or damage occurs as a result of ECT?
No, that's something I have never studied, and I'm not aware of any definitive studies of that question.
As you sit here today, are you aware of any pending ECT studies at all?
None.
All right. What is it about the seizure that you've learned that is the most likely source for the malfunction or dysfunction to the hippocampus following ECT as the likely source of the memory loss that occurs?
In none of my studies or my review of the literature have I ever been able to come up with an explanation that satisfied me.
Other than seizure as the source?
Well, seizure or the passage of electric current. Remember, I mentioned the difference between unilateral and bilateral ECT. Bilateral ECT, you're passing electric current through both hippocampi. But with unilateral ECT, you're only passing it through one hippocampus. So there is certainly a difference, partially obscured by the fact that after the electrical stimulus, then you have the seizure, which affects the whole brain. So that might muddy the waters a little bit in being able to tell the difference. But certainly, the electrical stimulus itself plays a role in the hippocampal dysfunction.
And other than the hippocampal dysfunction, do you have any reason to believe there's any other cause of the memory loss associated with ECT?
No.
Do you have a recollection of the longest seizure that you were ever able to document that continued after it no longer was evident on EEG and no longer visible by muscle activity?
Oh no, there would be no way I could tell.
Because it would be a guess?
Wouldn't even be a guess. There would be no way to even estimate. I mean, go ahead. That's my answer.
All right. How was it evolved in terms of the conclusion that a maximum duration of seizure was adopted by Somatics as its recommendation?
It was a statement unsubstantiated by any research by Dr. Max Fink, an authoritarian statement, an authority statement. That was it. And that became the standard.
And is still the standard today?
I don't know what the standard is today, but I don't imagine it's changed.
Would you say that it's the electricity that causes the desired effect or the seizure that causes the desired effect with ECT?
That is definitely a question that has never been perfectly resolved.
Can't have a seizure without electricity. Can't.
Well, you can in the original days, the original introduction of, let's call it convulsive therapy, a compound called, a chemical called metrazole was injected in a vein, and it caused a seizure. And those seizures were effective, but nobody ever compared them with the electrical stimulus. It just wasn't done. So we don't know. Soon thereafter, an Italian introduced electroconvulsive therapy, and the world adopted it within a year or two.
What's your understanding, if any, as to what the effect of the electricity is upon the brain cells?
It lowers dramatically and instantly the seizure threshold, and that induces widespread synchronous discharge of virtually all of the neurons in the brain, and that is the definition of a seizure.
What's your understanding, if any, as to the path that the electricity takes through the brain during ECT?
It is primarily a reflection of where the treatment electrodes are applied. Generally, the path is between, primarily, the treatment electrodes. So if it's bilateral ECT, then it goes transversely through the head. Or if it's unilateral ECT, the path will be primarily between the two electrodes.
Do you have an understanding as to whether or not it travels any other location within the brain other than between the placement of the electrodes?
Well, the brain is what is called a volume conductor. So, yes, it concentrates a large part between the two electrodes, but it spreads out like ripples of a pebble thrown in a pond. So, at some point, some amount of electricity will always reach other distant parts of the brain, although it may be very small.
Are you aware of any way to control within the brain the other portions of the brain being touched by the electricity induced by ECT?
I am not.
Are you aware of the amount of energy that's used in the brain outside of ECT?
That's used in the brain? Well, I'm not sure what you mean.
Any measure of electrical energy within the brain not including ECT application in its natural state?
Oh, well, certainly. I can't give you a figure, but there are numerous studies, electroencephalographic computer studies that have measured in great detail the electrical output of the resting brain.
And how does that compare to the electrical energy used by ECT?
The electrical energy used by ECT?
Correct.
Well, there's no comparison in the sense that the electrical energy used by ECT is many multiples of the spontaneous electrical energy of the resting brain.
And what is the maximum energy that the ECT somatic devices utilize?
99.4 joules.
And how does that compare to the energy of the resting brain?
I don't know. I have no idea.
It's not even 1% of that, is it?
I have no idea what the energy of the resting brain is. That is not my field.
Do you have any understanding that anyone at Somatics has ever incorporated studies of traumatic brain injury with ECT in any way?
Certainly not.
Do you know why?
There would be no reason to.
Okay. Is that because you don't believe that there could be a correlation between TBI, traumatic brain injury, and ECT?
Well, we're not in the business of doing studies of traumatic brain injury. We sell thymotrons.
Right. I'm referring to the 2011 executive
Correct.
summary.
Correct.
In that there were that many reports of memory loss, permanent, associated with ECT. How do you explain that as not being a potential risk associated with ECT?
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
Did all 529 reports identify it as quote-unquote permanent memory loss? Because that's implied in the question.
It was. Let's just take out the word permanent. How do you explain the 529 reports of memory loss?
I can't explain them since they were not objectively validated.
And how did you reach that conclusion that they were not objectively validated?
There were no objective evidence accompanying those reports in terms of neuropsychological testing, electroencephalograms, behavioral analysis, and so forth. They were what exactly they were, individuals stating that something had happened to them for which no evidence was presented.
Fair to say that Somatics took no steps to evaluate any of those reports?
Correct.
In that same report, there were, in that same executive summary of 2011, there was 298 reports of brain damage. How do you explain that?
Those are, again, unsubstantiated claims. And I have no idea of their validity.
What steps, if any, did Somatics take to assess the validity of those complaints?
No steps.
Okay. The executive summary identified 103 reports of death following ECT. How do you explain that?
I have no way of explaining that.
Did you have any reason to believe Somatics took any steps to investigate or evaluate any of the deaths that were identified in the 2011 executive summary?
No.
Are you aware of whether or not Somatics has any practice of investigating verbal complaints that it's received as to adverse events associated with ECT?
From whom?
Anybody.
No.
Okay.
I'm not aware of anything like that.
Has Somatics ever conducted any studies to determine whether any brain injury could be caused by ECT?
Somatics has never conducted any studies of any kind.
What's the maximum voltage, if you're aware, that can be utilized by a thymotron?
The voltage is not controlled. It's a constant current machine. I believe we don't adjust voltage, but I believe that it doesn't go over 220 volts, but that's just a recollection.
And then how about the maximum amperage that can be delivered by a thymotron?
Slightly less than 1 amp, perhaps 0.9 something.
Has Somatics ever conducted any studies that compared the potential side effects associated with single dose versus double dose?
Somatics has never conducted any studies.
Of any kind?
We're in the business of selling thymotrons.
Do you recall when Dr. Fink published that as a result of ECT, side effects such as disorientation, amnesia, agnosia, confabulation, aphasia, praxia, and delirium were potential risks associated?
Do I recall the year?
Do you recall that conclusion that he reached? Or is that news to you?
It's not news to me. I don't know if I saw him write that. I know that he, several of those words were used to me on many occasions in my conversations with Dr. Fink. I don't know where they were written. He wrote many papers before I became involved, before I became a psychiatrist. And he and I, he was my mentor.
Do you disagree with his conclusions?
Say that again, then.
That as a result of ECT, side effects could include disorientation, amnesia, agnosia, confabulation, aphasia, praxia, and delirium.
Yes, I agree that all those could occur as side effects of ECT. But we're not here talking about permanent side effects, correct?
Well, I'm asking, next question, is
Oh.
do you contend that none of those side effects could be lingering as long-term or permanent?
I do so contend.
In '78, Dr. Fink wrote for the Psychopathological Association that the principal complications of ECT are death, brain damage, memory impairment, and spontaneous seizures. These complications are similar to head trauma, to which EST has been compared. Had you ever heard that statement before?
Yeah.
Do you disagree with it?
It is such a broad statement. Would you mind reading that once more?
Not at all. It's from a 1978 article that Dr. Fink wrote
Right.
for the Journal of Psychopathological Association.
Right.
Quote, the principal complications of EST, or ECT, are death, brain damage, memory impairment, and spontaneous seizures. These complications are similar to head trauma, to which EST has been compared.
I disagree.
All right. But you'd heard that phrase, that statement before, correct?
That sounds like Max.
All right.
That's all I can say.
Was there ever a period of time that Dr. Fink no longer was seen as a mentor for you to rely upon or trust?
Objection vague and ambiguous. You can answer.
Well, after I had become an authority in my own right, we had many discussions, but after I published my first textbook on ECT, I no longer had the need to ask him questions from his experience or research, because I already knew all that, but we had many discussions.
So fair to say that you just disagree with his conclusion,
Yeah, especially the part about brain damage.
right? But you'd agree he is an authority in the field.
He is an authority in the field.
Has anyone advised you that Somatics has ever provided adequate warnings of risks of ECT to its customers?
No.